Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn, and I'm in the wrong industry because apparently my voice can stop wars, but this is the Lancool 3 from Lian Li, and in this video I'm going to be giving you my thoughts and feelings on this case after building in it in two completely different setups. I've done an in-depth build guide on the Lancool 3, which I purchased after getting a 420mm all-in-one cooler from Corsair, and I'll link to that video in the description. But here you can see it set up with both a standard setup with standard fans and then with Lian Li's SL140 and 120 Infinity fans, and I've also done videos on those. So I want to talk to you about my experiences of doing these two setups, what it's been like, the things that I discovered along the way, and the things that I think are pointless and the things that I think are awesome. Now, it's worth noting that Lian Li does some pretty fantastic cases. In my experience, I've had a number of different cases from the company that I've purchased myself or have been sent by that company to review or look at, and I've had some great experiences with building in these cases, and for a number of awesome reasons. The Lancool 3 is a pretty interesting case because, as I've said already, it supports up to a 420mm radiator, which is pretty insane. So you can mount a 420mm radiator on the top, and you also have flexibility to mount a lot of fans in a lot of different positions and loads of SSD storage. It also has some quirks to it. You'll see, for example, that you have these sort of openable doors on the front, so you can pull some panels on the front and then both back and front or sides open up with glass panels on either side. I'll be honest, I'm not really sure on the logic of that design, why you'd want a glass panel where all your cables are going to be, and it's definitely not for me because my cable management's terrible, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, what you can see on the top is you have USB-A, 2 USB-A ports, USB-C, 3.5mm, and some buttons to change the RGB lighting, and that's because, as standard, it comes with three 140mm RGB fans mounted on the front. It's worth noting that these aren't as fancy as the SL140 Infinity fans that you'll see later on, but they are pretty good, and you can see that you can focus through some colours here. The other highlight is that it also comes with a rear 140mm fan mounted in the back, but that isn't RGB, which is a shame because that would be nice. However, if you do fit a 420mm radiator, as I have in this video, you can see that you have to remove that rear fan anyway. Now, this case has a number of great features to it. They're always really well thought out, to be honest. You have a lot of removable panels with dust filters built into them. You can see there's a lot of holes for airflow as standard, and the fact that you can cram a 420mm radiator in here speaks volumes to the size of the thing. Now, this case is designed to support up to an E80X motherboard and up to a 220mm PSU, get to that in a little while. So it's got plenty of room, and yeah, it's got a fairly compact size. It is also quite heavy though once everything's loaded into it, and I think that again speaks to the build quality because it's not cheap. What you can see for the build purpose is that the doors are removable, so you can take those glass panels off, but here you can see that rear one that I was talking about, where all the cables are going to be. And I mean, at the moment it looks fine, but we'll have a bit of a problem with that later on. I want to talk to you about and show. And also the front tray removes. Now, this is one small complaint about this case actually, is this front tray. It does have a nice dust shielding on it, but if you take it off, it's actually a real pain to get back on. I found it really fiddly to put back on. And you're obviously going to want to take that off periodically to clean it when the dust goes into it. So it's a bit of a shame that it's a bit difficult to get off. But I only have a very small number of complaints about this case because for the most part, it's pretty fantastic. It's well thought out. It's very flexible. And it's nicely designed. There's just some quirks to it, and I think it's worth noting those as we go along. But the fact at this price that you get RGB fans included as standard, and 140mm ones at that, is pretty decent. That front panel is also adjustable, so you can put it closer to the motherboard tray as well, which is pretty curious. So there's some modularity to some degree. It's not as modular as something like the Dynamic Evo, which I've done a video on recently and separately, but it is still pretty flexible, and it does have some very clever, quirky design traits to it as well. So, and the highlights of just having fans included as standard that you can just get away with using, because to be honest, I just used those in the 420mm radiator to start out with to see how we'd get on. Now you can see from multiple angles that the lower half also has a lot of dust ventilation shaft areas, and obviously you can take those down and remove them as well. And the other interesting thing here is you'll see this bottom tray is also removable, and there's multiple screws in there. Now, the logic for this is you have options. So you can mount SSD in there, for example. With a couple of clips, you can screw them in from the underside into those trays, and then you have the flexibility to put SSDs there. And I'm going to show you more mounting spots for those in a minute. This tray is just held in place with a few screws, so you just need to unscrew those 2 screws and then take apart the tray itself. This is only if you want to do other things with it though, because you can mount a 360mm radiator to the bottom. So if you're doing a custom loop system, you have the option to put a radiator down there as well as at the front and on the top. So there's plenty of flexibility if you're doing a full hard custom system, for example. But as standard, you can also put your SSDs there. So if you want to show off your SSDs, or if you have loads of storage capabilities, you can do that. But you can also take the tray out, unscrew those bits, pops those out, and now you can put in some 320mm fans. So here you can see me putting in 3 120mm SL Infinity fans. So the Infinity fans, which are delightful, by the way, I really like these fans. Uni fans from Lian Li, really easy to install and set up and wire, more importantly. And I'm using these in combination with 140mm fans, but more on that in a little while. So you see that you can do this, which seems a bit strange if you think about it, because the power supply unit is right below, and also you have the hard drives below that as well, potentially. So there's going to be some blockage to the cooling. However, obviously radiators can go down there, so that's one option. And you can remove the hard drive trays, which I'll show you in a second. So you have some flexibility in what you're going to do in here, how you're going to set it up, and what you end up with. So it could be a completely different build to someone else, which is pretty nice. And they've given you a lot of different options there. At the rear, that tray also flips down on the other side, and you'll notice that there is a number of holes in there as well. That's because you have more SSD mounting points in there, which is pretty nuts. These rear panels also open up and come off. So they obviously hide away most of the cable shame. Although, as I'll show later on, it's a bit difficult to close if you're not terribly good at cable management, which I am renowned for not being, but we'll get to that. And you can see that you can take this tray off as well. So everything's removable, which is really nice during the build process. You can just slip that off, take it out of the way, and get on with building, and then put things back together. But with those rear panels off, you'll also see a number of other things of interest. So there's multiple different Velcro ties for tying your cables down. And there's also this removable tray which sits behind the motherboard, which you can use for mounting things like fan controllers. So if you're using Lian Li fans or Corsair fans or whatever, and you've got a control box you want to stick in there, you can put it there. So lots of flexibility in where to mount things. And obviously you have the bottom of it as well, where there's plenty of potential there. There's obviously dust trays down there as well for the power supply unit, so you can keep the dust out of your PSU, which is pretty nice. And then you can basically strip it down to nothing. And you can see once you've taken a lot of it apart, just what's going on and the flexibility of it. So there are points on the left-hand side underneath those cable ties where you can also mount controllers. And I'll show you that later on as well. But there's another highlight here. You have an adjustable cable tray, so you can see that you can unscrew that and move it around. This is interesting for 2 reasons, one of which is that you can mount an EATX motherboard in here, so if you need to push that out of the way for more space, you can do it. Also allows for a bit of an easier building process. Now the front tray with the 140mm fans is also removable, so you can see that you can unscrew a couple of thumb screws and you can just pop that off, and then you can obviously change those fans out. But you can also seat it back a bit further. You'll see if you look, there's some notches on the front of the case which allow you to position this closer to the back. So basically you can push it in further so it's then closer to the motherboard or your graphics card or whatever else. It's pretty neat. At the rear you also have 2 SSD mounting trays, and these are the easiest points to mount in because you'll see you need no other screws or anything else. They basically have some clips on either side of these mounts, so you push this out and then it clips into place, and then your SSD is just held with these basically 4 pins that sit on either side of it, and you can put 2 in that way. So if you have multiple SSDs, you can mount 2 in here, you can mount 3 in the front tray, for example, where the motherboard will be, and you can even mount some down in where the hard disk drive cages are as well. So you have plenty of storage options. If you're into sort of traditional drives rather than NVMe, you have the option of storing loads of things. Now there's an accessories box included in here which has extra hard drive trays, slightly different setup in there. I didn't use those, but you can find out more about them in the manual and on the site. And then there's also a nifty little box full of all the different screws that you need. Now this is one of the small complaints that I had about this, is that the basically all the screws come in a couple of bags and you have to sort them out yourself, which took me ages to do because there's obviously fan screws, motherboard screws, SSD screws, hard disk drive screws, washers, standoffs and more. So I had to sort them out, look at the hardware list and then work out where they're going to go. However, once you've emptied them all out, you can then section off this little box with plastic dividers which sit inside this little case, and then you can drop the relevant screws into specific holes so you know where they are, they're easy to access and they won't get mixed up. I just wish they'd come like that rather than being in plastic bags, but that's a small complaint. So you can set up one of the SSDs and you can see that you can put it in here. I'm obviously just using one, but you could put 3 in here potentially, and then just attach it to the rear of the case. Obviously that hides it away, and you could get most of the cables out of the way as well, because in theory your SATA power connector is going to be down there with the power supply unit anyway, and then you can just run the data cable up to your motherboard from down there and keep things looking neat. Now you also have 2 hard disk drive cages that you can put SSDs in, or 3.5-inch hard disk drives, and these are removable and movable, so you can actually slide them around in there as well. So you can see that you can take both of them out, and they have screws pre-installed on the underside. Now it's worth noting that they are set up ever so slightly differently, so it's not actually possible to move both of them in a sort of logical way. You can see that they're positioned slightly differently, so you have to sort of take that into account when moving them. But you could take one out and slide the other one over to position it slightly differently to give you more space for cables and things like that with your power supply. So you can see there are runs in here where they will sit. The other thing that was interesting to me is this is a 1200 watt power supply unit from NZXT, and obviously a lot of potential cables going on in here and for a variety of different devices. Now I've done guides on all these different things that I'll link to in the description every step of this basically, so if you want to find out more about it. But what I wanted to show is the fact that you can fit this PSU, which is not a small PSU at this size wattage, in here and still have plenty of space, even with the hard drive cages in. And this is speaking back to what I was saying earlier about how this case is capable of taking loads of different things, including a large radiator, larger motherboard, large power supply unit, and still have plenty of room as well. So this is the Corsair H170i Elite Caplix cooler, 420mm, comes with 340mm fans, and you only have the option to top mount this really as the easiest way. Potentially front mounting is an option. You obviously can't put it on the bottom. Top mounting is the most logical in my opinion anyway. This is what you'd want to do. You have to install it with pipes at the back, the tubes from the radiator at the back, and you also have to remove that rear fan in order to do it. So keep those things in mind. But this is the setup here. So basically I'm leaving the original RGB fans on the front to pull cold air in, and then I'm exhausting out the top through the radiator. And obviously we'll have some natural airflow through the rear. What was interesting was there was still quite a bit of space in here, but you do need to take some things into account. The case details, for example, note that you should use low profile RAM, and you can see the struggle of trying to get back in here. You should use low profile RAM on your motherboard, otherwise you might have problems. I didn't, but I did have fairly small RAM, and I mounted things in the wrong order ever so slightly, which meant I then couldn't plug in the motherboard cables. So keep that in mind as well, that you'll need to mount the motherboard first and then the cables and then the all-in-one cooler, not the other way around, because I wanted to check that it would fit in there. But it does fit quite nicely, and they've supplied some special screws in order to screw it into the top of the housing. And you'll see just looking at the top just how many screw holes there are. So obviously you have the option to use 360mm radiator upper instead, and a lot of fans potentially instead as well. So there's a lot of variety that you could do. Obviously a 360mm radiator would be easier to fit in, but it's a nice option to have that larger 420mm. Now on the left hand side of the rear of the case, you'll see there are positions where you can mount controllers. So for example, Commander Core from Corsair will pop in there. And then once you've got that set up, you can turn it on. But there are multiple mounting points for these things. And this was the initial finished product of what it looked like. I obviously have a tiny 3060 GPU in there. It's not the 40 series, but it does demonstrate just how much room there is in there. I'll leave all the specs in the description so you can find out things about minimum and maximum sizes of what you can put in. But then you can see the process of when I'm mounting the doors back on at the end. Now I haven't put loads and loads of things in here. Obviously I haven't put any extra fans in potentially, not loads anyway. And yet I still found it was quite difficult to get the door to shut. Now, I haven't done any cable tidying with plastic cable ties or using the loops like you probably should. And the reason for that was, as you've seen, I'm going to swap things out in a minute. But what I wanted to do is to test and see how we got on with it. And what I found was that even when you close those sort of inner doors, the outer doors are a little bit tricky to get on, or at least it will go on, but then it won't shut very easily. And then it just kept coming open, which is potentially a problem. Obviously, if your PC is just sitting there on your desk, it's probably not going to just swing open. But if you are going to be moving it around a bit, as I am, then it is potentially an issue where the door just won't shut and it kept falling open, even when the front panel was in place and those clips are holding it in place as well. Quick note, there are some little clips down the bottom here that you're meant to remove during transport. I was just holding on to those by keeping them there, but you should take them off. But that isn't what was causing it to fall open, because I did notice that it was happening even with those off, but you can see that it just drops open here. So one small complaint about the case, although that is obviously down to my cable management, but what I want to say basically is if you don't have super good cable management, that could potentially be an issue. Also, again, I'm not too sure about why you have a glass panel on the rear anyway. You do have these nice doors which are hiding things away, but I just much prefer the design of like the Evo lineup or the Dynamic XL or the other ones where you have air panels on the rear and a bit more space. I just felt like this was a little bit tighter to build in the extra sort of side bit of it. There's just not much going on back there, and it's a shame. It's the one thing that lets it down, so I think it's worth focusing on. But once you finish with that, the complete build is actually really nice. So it's a nice looking machine even with the basic setup. And the thing is, you could just do this. I found that it ran quietly and efficiently with this setup here. So obviously I've only got 6 fans in this build, which is pretty, I think that might be the smallest amount of fans I've ever put in a case. And I wanted to just test it out and see how we got on with this setup, just a basic sort of setup. Yes, it's a large cooler, not cheap necessarily. And I'll leave the specs in the description. This is an AMD 7700X CPU. It's got 32 gigs of crucial DDR5 RAM, a couple of NVMe drives, and more. So it's not a cheap system, but it's still, you know, fairly basic in terms of the fan setup. But then what I wanted to do is basically swap that entire system out. So I spent a bit of time, and you've seen some of it already, swapping out the fans. So I put the 3 120mm Infinity fans on the bottom. I swapped out the front standard fans for 140mm, and then I've got 140mm on the radiator. I actually found that despite adding the extra fans, it ran quieter, and it actually was better at cooling, which I suppose is not surprising, but the radiator setup then meant the CPU ran cooler. So it is worth doing this, and you can see aesthetic wise, it looks a lot nicer. So there you go, an in-depth look at the Lancool 3, my feelings on it, what it was like to build in various different ways. Check out the build guide if you want to find out more and see an in-depth sort of setup guide to every single step along the way. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.